I want to tell you something before I start. I've filed 17 official incident reports since the Galactic Peacekeeping Accord was signed. 17. Some of them were about supply shortages, one was about a malfunctioning atmospheric processor, and 3 were about bureaucratic delays so absurd they would make your head hurt just reading them. But this report right here, is different. This isn't a report, actually. I threw out the official format halfway through writing it. The forms don't have boxes for what I need to say. There's no checkbox labeled, "Watched something change my understanding of what life is capable of," and there's no field for "witness something I will never fully stop thinking about." So I'm writing it like this instead, just talking. Just telling it the way it happened, from the beginning, in the order that it happened, the way you'd tell a story to someone sitting across from you at a table. Because that's the only way I know how to make it make sense. My name is Counselor Dresh Valen. I serve, or I served, depending on how you want to count the months, as a civilian liaison officer aboard the Keithon observation platform, which is a very formal title for what is essentially a glass and steel ring floating 17 kilometers above a dying world called Marin Roman 4. Marin Roman 4. If you've never heard of it, that's probably fine. Most people in the Galactic Assembly hadn't heard of it either, until about 4 months before all this happened. Before that, it was just another classified observation zone. A planet flagged for atmospheric collapse, stripped of its upper biosphere by a century of poorly regulated extraction mining, now slowly choking under a sky that had turned the color of rust and copper and old blood. The Assembly had been arguing about what to do with Marin Roman 4 for 11 years. 11 years of committees, of reports, of peacekeeping proposals that went nowhere, of extraction companies lobbying for just one more drilling season, of refugees from the surface filing petitions that sat unread in administrative queues for months at a time. And then the Vithara arrived. That's when everything changed. That's when the arguing stopped and something else, something much worse, took its place. Chapter 2. Set up the world we were living in. Let me paint you the picture, because you need to understand what the platform looked like before everything fell apart. The Keithon platform was shaped like a lens. That's the simplest way to describe it. A wide, curved disc, flattened at the center and thick at the rim, with observation galleries running the full circumference at 3 different elevation levels. From the lower gallery, you could look straight down through the reinforced transparent panels and watch Marin Roman 4 turning below you. A slow, sickly rotation. The cloud cover so dense and orange that you could almost imagine it was some kind of sunset, some beautiful natural phenomenon, rather than a biosphere in the process of destroying itself. The platform housed about 300 people on any given rotation, mostly assembly staff, administrators, analysts, environmental scientists who were documenting the collapse in real time, hoping that their data would eventually convince someone somewhere to do something. There were also a few diplomatic observers from various member species, and a contingent of Galactic Peacekeeping Corps soldiers stationed at the docking bays and the primary airlock corridors. The Peacekeeping Corps soldiers were Tharax. If you don't know the Tharax, imagine something roughly bipedal but wider at the shoulder than most species think a living creature should be. 3 rows of sensory filaments running along the ridge of their skulls, thick armored plating along the forearms and shins that grows naturally, not artificial, just bone, layered and dense, and eyes that are positioned almost at the sides of their heads, giving them a field of vision that wraps nearly 300 degrees around. They were effective soldiers, everyone said so. Good at maintaining order, good at following protocols, good at standing exactly where they were supposed to stand and doing exactly what they were supposed to do and not much else. The Tharax peacekeeping approach was fundamentally reactive. You put them somewhere, they held that position. You told them to watch a door, they watched that door. You gave them a rule book, they followed the rule book. That was the system we had. And for 11 years, for all those years of arguing in committees and filed petitions, that system had been enough, because nothing had really happened. Not yet. The platform itself had a kind of institutional smell to it. Not bad exactly, just recycled. The atmospheric processors did their best, but there was always that faint undercurrent of recirculated air, of metal and synthetic fiber, and the particular chemical signature of the filtration units working overtime. The corridors were wide enough for 2 Tharax soldiers in full equipment to walk side by side, which gave them a vaguely oversized feeling when you were walking them alone, the way empty theaters feel large in a way they don't when they're full. I'd been on the platform for 8 months by the time this happened, long enough that I'd stopped noticing most of it, the hum of the atmospheric systems, the way the artificial lighting shifted slightly redder during the simulated evening cycle, the distant, almost felt rather than heard vibration of the docking bay mechanisms when a supply shuttle came in. Long enough that I'd gotten used to the view of Roman 4 below us. Long enough that I'd stopped thinking the situation could get worse. Chapter 3. The VETHARA arrive. The first ship appeared on long-range sensors 9 days before everything happened. At that distance, it was just an anomaly, a mass signature that didn't match any registered vessel in the assembly's transit logs. The analysis team flagged it, filed it, and sent it up the chain. Standard protocol. By day 4, it was close enough to resolve visually. We gathered in the main observation gallery, about 40 of us, everyone who wasn't on a duty rotation or asleep, and we stood at the panoramic windows and watched the ship slide into the upper orbital band of Roman 4 gravity, well like a blade being drawn slowly out of its sheath. It was enormous. That word doesn't really do it justice, but I don't have a better one. The VETHARA command vessel was shaped like a crescent, a wide, sweeping curve with both ends tapering to points, the concave inner face of the crescent ringed with weapons systems that the platform's passive sensors couldn't fully catalog. We could see the pulse charge arrays, the obvious ones, the kind of heavy ordnance platforms that were standard on any military vessel of that class. But there were other installations along the hull that our sensors returned incomplete readings on, and that was more unsettling than the ones we could identify. The VETHARA hadn't been in this sector for 60 years. The last time they'd shown up at a world under assembly observation, it had ended in what the official records called an administrative correction, and what anyone who'd actually been there called a massacre. I want to be honest with you, I was afraid. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Standing at that window, watching that ship complete its entry into orbital position with an unhurried, absolute confidence. The confidence of something that has never had reason to move quickly because nothing has ever seriously threatened it. I felt a specific flavor of fear that I hadn't experienced before. It wasn't panic, it was something colder. It was the recognition that the situation had just changed categories. Admiral Veth Salon, the VETHARA commander, transmitted a communication to the platform 6 hours after arrival. I was present in the command center when we received it. The message was short. It was delivered in Galactic Standard, which was itself a message within the message, because the VETHARA don't typically bother with Standard. Using it was a kind of deliberate condescension, like speaking very slowly and clearly to someone you don't think is particularly bright. The message said, the VETHARA claim legal right of resource extraction over the Marin system under the pre-assembly sovereignty accords of the Third Compact. All assembly personnel are requested to clear the observation platform within 48 hours. This request is being made as a courtesy. A courtesy. That last word sat in the room after the transmission ended. Nobody spoke for about 10 seconds. Commander Orith Polys, the platform's senior officer, a Cellaran, long-limbed, with the characteristically careful, precise movements of her species, pulled up the pre-assembly sovereignty accords on her data terminal and stood there reading for a moment. Then she set the terminal down. The accords they're citing were superseded, she said, in the 7th Assembly revision, 22 years ago. They know that, said Davin Korath, one of the Assembly legal analysts, a heavy-set Brunnian who had been on the platform for 3 years, and who had the particular weariness of someone who has spent too long watching bureaucratic processes fail to prevent predictable disasters. Yes, said Commander Polys. They know. Chapter 4. Build tension the hours before. The 48 hours they'd given us felt like a gift and a threat at the same time. During those 2 days, the platform became a different kind of place. The institutional smell was still there, the recycled air still circulating, the atmospheric processors still humming, but underneath all of that familiar noise there was something new, a tension that wasn't quite panic but was moving steadily in that direction. People clustered. You could watch it happen, the way social animals cluster when threat appears, small groups forming in corridors, in the communal dining area, in the corners of workrooms. Voices dropping not because anyone told them to be quiet, but because the situation itself seemed to require it. The Tharax peacekeeping contingent, 16 soldiers stationed on the platform, went a full alert status. Their commander, a Tharax senior rank officer named Brood Cashin, was a meticulous professional who took his responsibilities seriously. He repositioned his soldiers to the primary access corridors and the main docking bay, established a watch rotation that kept 4 soldiers active at all times, and filed a formal request for reinforcement through the Assembly's emergency military channel. The response he got back was not encouraging. The Assembly's Peacekeeping Coordination Office informed him that the nearest available reinforcement unit was 17 hours away, that the situation was under diplomatic review, and that no action should be taken that could be interpreted as escalatory. No action that could be interpreted as escalatory. I was standing next to Cashin when he read that response. He had very little visible expression. The Tharax typically don't. The physiology doesn't support it in the way human or Celeran faces do, but I'd been on the platform long enough to read some of the micro-signals. The way his sensory filaments lay flat against his skull rather than their normal relaxed upright position. The particular stillness that settled over him. He stood there for a moment. Then he said quietly, 16. I said, what? I have 16 soldiers, he said. The Vethara command vessel has a standard complement of 400 combat personnel and a weapons loadout that could crack the platform's hull in 3 minutes if they chose to do it. He wasn't being dramatic, he was being accurate. So, I said, because I didn't know what else to say. So, he said, and he went back to repositioning his people. I watched him go and I thought, he's going to do exactly what he's trained to do. He's going to hold those corridors and watch those doors and follow the rule book, because that's what he's capable of, and it won't be enough, and he knows it, and he's going to do it anyway. And then the second transmission came in. Chapter 5, The Signal from Nowhere. This is the part that nobody expected. Not the Vethara, not the Assembly, not Cashin and his 16 soldiers, not me. The signal came in on a frequency that our communications array was technically capable of receiving, but that nobody had ever used in the 8 months I'd been on the platform. I know this because our communications officer, a young Pelin named Tiv, barely old enough to have graduated from the Assembly's training program, stared at her panel for a full 4 seconds before she said anything. Then she said, Commander, I'm receiving a transmission. It's coming from. I'm not sure where it's coming from. Commander Polys looked up from the evacuation logistics she'd been grimly working through. Origin. That's what I can't figure out. Tiv's fingers moved across her panel. The carrier wave is consistent with a long-range relay bounce, but the point of origin isn't registering. It's like it's coming from the local space around the planet, but I can't lock a position. The sender doesn't want to be located. Put it through. What came through wasn't a voice. Not at first. It was a data package, a burst transmission compressed that took the platform systems about 8 seconds to process. And when the processing resolved, what appeared on the main screen was a single line of text in Galactic Standard. Keithon platform, message received, hold position, assistance inbound. Terran Expeditionary Rapid Response Unit 7. The room went quiet. Polly's read it again. Then she said, Terran. I knew what she was thinking because I was thinking the same thing. Humanity, the species everyone in the Galactic Assembly still called Terrans, even though they preferred humans, because old habits in bureaucratic language die slowly, had been members of the Assembly for 60 years. They were, in the polite language of Assembly diplomatic correspondence, a developing member species, which was a diplomatic way of saying they were relatively new and relatively small and nobody particularly expected them to do anything surprising. They had a military, everyone knew that. They'd had one before they joined the Assembly, and they'd maintained one after, integrating some of their forces into the peacekeeping core framework while keeping certain units under their own command structure. The Assembly's Military Oversight Committee had various opinions about this, most of them slightly uncomfortable, filed under cultural sensitivity protocols. But Terran Expeditionary Rapid Response, I'd never heard of it. Nobody in that room, as far as I could tell, had heard of it. How far out are they? Polly's asked. Tiv ran the calculation. Based on the relay bounce pattern, if I had to guess. She paused. Close, very close, but I can't get a lock. They're masking, said Davin Korath from the corner, and something in his voice had changed. He was looking at the screen with an expression I couldn't quite name. They don't want the Vethara to know they're there. Polly's looked at him. Can the Vethara detect them? If our sensors can't find them, Korath said slowly, I'm guessing neither can the Vetharas. Chapter 6. What we knew about humans. I should tell you what we thought we knew about human soldiers. What everyone on the platform understood, collectively, about Terran military capability. The Therax peacekeeping contingent had a word they used, not dismissively, but with a kind of resigned pragmatism, for species whose military capacity was considered non-decisive in a high-stakes confrontation. The word translates roughly as support weight, meaning something like useful to have but not load-bearing. The implication being that in a real fight, you couldn't build your strategy around them. Humans were generally filed in this category, not because they weren't capable fighters. They were, by the accounts that existed, surprisingly effective in the right circumstances, but because of scale. Humanity's total military force was relatively small by the standards of species that had been operating interstellar civilizations for centuries. Their technology, while inventive, didn't match the raw manufacturing capacity of assembly heavyweights like the Therax or the Celaran. And nobody had ever seen human soldiers operate in a context like this. The interventions they'd participated in through the Peacekeeping Corps had been lower-intensity, peacekeeping operations, not combat operations. The situations where they'd been tested against a force like the Vethara simply hadn't come up. So when Cashin, who had been standing in the back of the command center, listening to all of this with his filaments flat against his skull, finally spoke up, what he said surprised me. He said, I've read some of their combat histories. Polly's looked at him, and they are not what the summary assessments suggest, he said. The summaries look at their numbers, their fleet tonnage, their manufacturing output. He paused. They don't look at the right things. What do you mean? He was quiet for a moment. There are things about human physiology and human psychology that don't show up in the assessments because the assessment writers considered them irrelevant to military capacity. He paused again, and this time the pause felt heavier. I don't think they're irrelevant. Before anyone could ask him to continue, Tiv's panel lit up. "Commander," she said, "I've got movement. Multiple objects entering the upper atmosphere from the night side approach. They're not coming from the Vethara vessel." We all looked at the screen. And then Marin 4, rust-colored sky began to fall apart. Chapter 7. Build tension, the sky that broke open. It happened fast, and it happened completely without warning. And those two things together, the speed and the total absence of anything that resembled a warning, were what made it so disorienting. One moment the sensors were showing us the night-side atmospheric band above Marin 4, that dense copper-brown cloud layer that never moved much because the surface winds below it had been disrupted by decades of extraction operations. And the next moment there were objects moving through it. Not ships, not in the usual sense. Objects. Small, fast, angular. The platform's tracking systems registered them as approximately human-sized, give or take, with heat signatures that were being actively suppressed, which was why they'd been invisible until they were already inside the cloud layer. Each object was surrounded by some kind of ablative shielding that was burning away as they descended, leaving a brief thermal trail that the sensors could just barely catch before it dispersed. "How many?" Polly said. Tiv was counting. "I'm reading," she shook her head. "The suppression system is making it hard, at least 40, maybe more. They're in the atmosphere. They're in it, moving fast. Descent vector looks like they're targeting the surface directly below the platform's orbital position." Tiv looked up. "Commander, the approach geometry means the Vethara sensors should have spotted them. Why aren't the Vethara?" "Because they're looking at the platform," said Koreth. "They're looking at us. They're not looking down." I pressed myself against the observation window and looked down at Marin 4 surface, as if I could actually see through 17 kilometers of atmosphere with my bare eyes. I couldn't, obviously. All I could see was that same sick orange cloud cover, thick and featureless. But I knew something was descending through it. And then Commander Cashin, who had also moved to the window, said something very quietly, something I had to ask him to repeat because I wasn't sure I'd heard it right. He said they came from orbit. "Without ships." I said, "What?" "The thermal signatures," he said. "The ablative shielding on each object. They didn't launch from a planetary surface. They came from orbital altitude and they came down individually." He looked at me, and even with Tharak's features, even without the kind of facial expressiveness I was used to reading, I could see something there. Something I recognized from the feeling in my own chest. They dropped themselves out of orbit, individually, in what appears to be powered atmospheric descent equipment. He paused, into a cloud layer that has wind shear exceeding 400 kilometers per hour. I stared at him. "Into a dying atmosphere," he continued, "without carriers, without support craft, in individual descent units, against an opposing force that outmatches them technologically and numerically." He was quiet for a second. "Why?" I didn't have an answer for that. I don't think he expected one. "Who does that?" I said finally. Cashin looked back at the window, at the featureless orange cloud layer below us, through which something was currently falling at tremendous speed. "Apparently," he said, "humans." Chapter 8. What the Vethara did next. Here's the thing about the Vethara that you need to understand, if you want to understand how the next part happened. The Vethara were extraordinarily competent at the kind of warfare that civilizations fight when they've had centuries to formalize it. Structured engagements, ship-to-ship combat, orbital bombardment, ground force deployment from secure landing zones with established perimeters. They had doctrine, and their doctrine worked, and they had never had serious reason to update it because nothing in their significant military history had ever required them to. They thought in categories. This is species X with military capacity, Y operating from position Z, insert into decision matrix. Output appropriate response. What they were not equipped for, what the next several hours would demonstrate, catastrophically from their perspective, was an engagement that didn't fit their categories at all. Admiral Salon's second transmission arrived 4 hours before the 48-hour deadline. It was shorter than the first one. Assembly observers, your 48-hour window has been extended by 6 hours. We are detecting minor atmospheric anomalies that require brief analysis before our extraction teams deploy. This extension is granted as a courtesy. I read that and I started laughing, which surprised me because nothing felt particularly funny. But there was something about the word courtesy appearing again. The second time they'd used that specific word, combined with the knowledge of what I now understood was moving through Roman 4 atmosphere below us, that struck some involuntary register. Korath looked at me. What? They detected the heat signatures, I said. They just don't know what they were. They're calling them atmospheric anomalies. He considered that. They've never seen a human orbital drop before. Nobody has, I said. I don't think any of us have. I don't know if anyone outside of whatever human unit this is has ever seen a human orbital drop before. We looked at each other. So the Vethara think it's weather, Korath said slowly. Apparently, I said. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said very quietly, good. Chapter 9, The First Contact Surface. What happened on the surface of Roman 4 during those 6 hours? I'm piecing this together from the after-action report that was eventually shared with the platform's senior staff, and from conversations with the soldiers themselves, which came later. I wasn't on the surface. I was on the platform, watching sensor data and atmosphere readouts and trying to understand what I was seeing. But I want to tell you what happened down there as accurately as I can, because it matters. Roman 4 still had a surface population. Not many. The atmospheric collapse had displaced most of the original inhabitants over the decades, and the ones who remained were clustered in sealed habitat complexes, surviving on recycled atmosphere and food grown under artificial light. The largest of these complexes, Havenport Station, housed about 12,000 people, mostly the elderly, the ones who'd refused to leave, some children born into the situation. Families who had been here through generations of decline and who had nowhere else to go. The Vethara's extraction plan, we learned this later from intelligence analysis, involved deploying ground teams to neutralize Havenport Station's communications array before beginning the extraction operation. Standard protocol: blind the civilians, isolate them, proceed with extraction. Nothing complicated, nothing they hadn't done before. Their ground teams were scheduled to deploy at the end of the 48-hour window. 4 Vethara dropships, each carrying 20 combat soldiers, total 80 personnel, against 12,000 civilians in a sealed habitat with no military capacity whatsoever. What they didn't know, what no one outside the human military command chain apparently knew, was that 43 human soldiers had already been on the ground for 5 hours before the Vethara deployment was scheduled to begin. 43 humans against 80 Vethara. Or that's how the number breakdown looked on paper. That's the version where you count bodies without looking at the right things, which is exactly what Cashin had been talking about. What the 43 humans had done with those 5 hours on the surface of a dying world with 400 km/h wind shear in its upper atmosphere, and a collapsed ecological system, and an oxygen content in the breathable range, but just barely. What they'd done with those 5 hours was extraordinary. They'd found the Vethara's planned deployment corridors. They'd mapped the approach routes that the Vethara dropships were going to use. They'd established positions, not defensive positions, not hold-the-door positions the way the Therax doctrine would have done, but a series of interlocking observation and interdiction positions that covered every approach route to Havenport Station simultaneously. They'd also, somehow, in between all of that, made contact with the Havenport Station Management Council and established a communication channel. and they'd spent approximately 90 minutes explaining the situation to the council, and then working with them to move the most vulnerable residents to the deepest interior sections of the habitat, away from any external-facing walls. I'm going to let you sit with that for a second. In 5 hours on a dying world, in wind that was actively hostile to exposed human biology, having just dropped from orbit individually in atmospheric descent equipment, with no support infrastructure, no supply chain, no carrier ships overhead, they'd done all of that. And then the Vithara dropped. Chapter 10, Climax: What Dropped from the Sky. I want to be precise about this part, because this is the part I actually witnessed, not from the surface, but from the platform, through the sensor array, watching a situation unfold that I still don't fully have language for. The Vithara deployment began at the 48-hour mark. 4 dropships, descending through the atmosphere in a tight formation, approaching Havenport Station from the north and east along 2 parallel approach corridors. Standard tactical deployment. Clean, organized, confident. The dropships hit an electromagnetic interference pattern approximately 12 kilometers from Havenport Station. I watched it happen on the sensor display. The 4 ships went from clean navigation signals to fragmented, confused readings in the space of about 10 seconds. Not destroyed, not damaged, just suddenly operating without clear sensor data, like someone had put a bag over their heads. "What is that?" Tiv said. Korath, who had been staring at the display, said very quietly, "Portable M suppression array. Multiple units, overlapping field coverage." He paused. "That's not standard peacekeeping core equipment." "So what is it?" "It's human," he said. "It's specifically human. I've read about it in technology exchange briefings. They developed it in-house. They haven't shared the specifications with the assembly, and the reason they haven't shared it is that it works on Vithara navigation systems, and they wanted to keep that capability private until they needed it." The 4 dropships, now operating on manual navigation without sensor support, slowed significantly. The Vithara were good pilots, well-trained, disciplined, but navigating through a dense, turbulent atmosphere on manual in low visibility conditions with disrupted systems is genuinely difficult, regardless of how good you are. They slowed, they spread out, their tight formation loosened. And that's when the humans moved. What the sensor data showed was initially confusing, because I was looking for something that matched my mental model of combat: large movements, obvious force on force, the kind of engagement you could read clearly from above. That's not what I saw. What I saw was small movements, precise, individual, fast. Objects, human-sized objects, shifting positions in a pattern that took me several seconds to understand was not random. They were herding. That's the word that came to me eventually, though I didn't use it out loud until later. The 43 humans on the surface were physically herding 4 Vithara dropships, 80 combat soldiers, fully equipped away from Havenport Station. Not by firepower, not by force-on-force engagement. By being in exactly the right positions to make every approach route look dangerous, every corridor look occupied. The Vithara pilots, unable to get clear sensor readings, saw movement ahead of them on each approach. They adjusted. The humans adjusted. The Vithara adjusted again. The humans adjusted again. The dropships kept moving, kept trying to find a clear route, kept not finding one. They went 3 kilometers off their planned approach path before their commander apparently ordered them to halt and recalculate. While they were halted, recalculating, trying to get their systems back online through the M interference, 3 of the 4 dropships landed. One of them landed in a position that a human soldier had specifically chosen for them. I don't know how to explain this next part, except to just describe what the sensor data showed. The human who had chosen that landing position, I learned later her name was Staff Sergeant Cale Morrow, a woman of apparently unremarkable height, and Bild, whose physical description in the after-action report would tell you nothing whatsoever about what she was about to do, had spent approximately 40 minutes preparing the ground around a specific landing zone. The Vethara dropship set down in that zone. 40 Vethara soldiers deployed from it, standard formation, weapons ready, expecting resistance. What they got instead was complete, total, absolute silence for approximately 8 seconds. Then the M suppression field around the ship, already disrupting its navigation systems, shifted frequency in a way that the ship's engineers apparently hadn't encountered before, and the dropship's communication array went offline. 40 Vethara soldiers on the ground, in a location they hadn't planned to land in, cut off from their ship's communication systems, with no clear sensor data of the surrounding environment, on a world with a hostile atmosphere that their equipment was rated for but not designed for optimally, in a situation that did not match any scenario in their tactical doctrine. The after-action report uses very neutral language to describe what happened next. I'll just tell you, the 40 Vethara soldiers from that dropship were disarmed and secured, without casualties on either side, in 14 minutes. 14 minutes with 8 humans. 8. Part 2, What Held the Line. Chapter 11, From the Platform, What We Saw. Up on the platform, we were watching sensor data that we only partially understood, and the partial understanding was somehow worse than not understanding anything at all. Like reading a book where every third word is blacked out, you get enough to know something significant is happening, not enough to be sure what. Commander Polly's had been standing at the sensor display for what felt like hours. She had a stillness to her that I'd come to associate with her processing mode, the Cellaran equivalent of what humans apparently call going somewhere else in your head. She was watching and calculating and not speaking, and none of us were interrupting her. The Vethara command vessel above us had gone to what our sensors read as an elevated alert status, approximately 40 minutes after their dropships hit the M interference. We could see the power signature shift, a redistribution of energy through their systems that suggested either they were preparing additional deployment or they were preparing to do something to us. Or both. Cashin was back in the command center by then. He'd been cycling his soldiers through their positions, keeping them fresh, and he'd come in to review the sensor data himself. He stood next to Polly's, and they looked at the same display without talking for a while. Then Polly said, "They're preparing a second wave." Cashin studied the display, agreed, larger. "The platform isn't defensible against a second wave," she said, "and this wasn't alarm, just fact. Not with 16. Not with 60, Cashin said. I moved closer to them. "What's the second wave going to look like?" "Based on the power redistribution pattern," said Cashin, "I would estimate 200 personnel minimum, possibly more, not dropships this time." He pointed at a feature of the Vethara vessel's sensor signature that I couldn't read, but apparently he could. "Assault carriers. They're going to do this properly the second time." "When?" "Hours, maybe less." I thought about the 43 humans on the surface, about what 8 of them had done in 14 minutes against 40 Vethara soldiers, with the element of position and surprise. And I thought about 200 Vethara assault troops coming down in carriers, properly coordinated, now knowing that something was on the surface that shouldn't be there. I said, "Is this going to be enough?" Neither Polly's nor Cashin answered me right away. Then the communication channel, the one the humans had used for their first message, opened again. Chapter 12, The Voice. The voice that came through was not what I expected. I don't know what I expected, something formal maybe. Military precision, crisp delivery, technical language. That's what a peacekeeping corps transmission sounds like, structured, protocol forward, clear chain of command established in the first 3 words. What came through was a woman's voice, and she sounded like she'd been running. Not panicked, nowhere near panicked, but the kind of slightly elevated breathing that means someone's body is working hard while their mind stays completely focused. And her voice had a quality to it that I noticed immediately and still notice when I remember it. She was talking the way you talk to someone you trust completely, without wasting time on anything unnecessary. Keithon Platform, this is Major Rin Doherty, Terran Expeditionary Rapid Response, Unit 7. I've got a status update for you. Commander Polly stepped to the communication panel. Major Doherty, this is Commander Orith Polly's. We're tracking the situation from here. What is your assessment? There was a pause, brief, 2 seconds, maybe 3. And in that pause I could hear wind. Not a recording artifact, not system noise, actual wind. The 400 km/h nightmare wind of Marin Roman 4 lower atmosphere, somehow caught in the background of the transmission. She was outside or near an exterior surface while she was making this call. Phase 1 is complete, Doherty said. We've got 80 Vethara personnel secured on the surface, non-lethal engagement, no casualties either side. Havenport Station is secure. We've established a perimeter that will hold for about 2 hours against standard ground assault. Polly said, the Vethara are preparing a second wave. Our estimate is 200 personnel, assault carriers. Another pause. Then Doherty said, yeah, we clocked that. And the way she said it, not surprised, not alarmed, just acknowledging, the way you acknowledge information you already had, told me something important about the difference between what this woman was and what I'd been expecting. Major, Polly said carefully, you have 43 personnel. A second wave of 200 in carriers with updated tactical intelligence about your positions. The calculus changes significantly. It does, Doherty agreed. Do you require evacuation? The pause this time was longer. I had the strange feeling that on the other end of that transmission, in a dying world with wind screaming outside and 80 secured Vethara soldiers somewhere nearby, Major Rin Doherty was taking a moment to consider her words. Not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because she wanted to say it right. Then she said, Commander Polly's, I need you to understand something about why my unit is here. We're not here because we were ordered to be. We were ordered to stay clear of this sector. There's a diplomatic channel active and command didn't want to complicate it. We came anyway. On our own authority, which means on my authority, because I filed the request and I'm accountable for this deployment. She paused. I made that call because 12,000 people in Havenport Station have been waiting 11 years for someone to actually show up instead of filing another report, and I decided to be the someone who showed up. The command center was very quiet. I'm not leaving, she said. Not until those 12,000 people are safe. So what I need from you, Commander, isn't evacuation. What I need from you is whatever you've got that might help us hold a perimeter for 2 more hours. Chapter 13. What KASHEN did. Cashin left the command center about 3 minutes after that transmission ended, and he was gone for 11 minutes. And when he came back, he was accompanied by his 16 Tharax soldiers, all of them in full equipment, and he was carrying something on his data pad that he handed to Commander Polly's without preamble. She looked at it. What is this? A deployment request, he said. Surface deployment, Tharax Peacekeeping Standard Unit, Emergency Civilian Protection Protocol. He paused. It's within my authority to invoke that protocol. I've invoked it. I need your command countersignature. Polly's looked at the data pad, then she looked at Cashin. You're taking your people down there, she said. The humans are holding a perimeter for 12,000 civilians against an incoming assault wave with 43 personnel, he said. The Emergency Civilian Protection Protocol exists precisely for situations like this. Another pause. Also, he said, and something in his voice that I hadn't heard before had arrived, something careful, deliberate, that took me a moment to identify as what I can only call a kind of admission. I have been a soldier for 24 years. I have held positions. I have watched doors. I have followed rule books. He stopped. I have never once done what Major Doherty did. I have never filed a request on my own authority to go somewhere my commanding officers didn't send me because 12,000 people were waiting for someone to show up. He looked at Polly steadily. I would like to go be useful. Polly's looked at the data pad for another moment. Then she countersigned it. Chapter 14. The perimeter holds. What happened in the next 2 hours? I have to tell you that I spent most of it in the command center watching sensor data and secondary feed from the platform's atmospheric monitoring array, which was never designed for tracking tactical engagements, but which was what we had. The second Vethara wave deployed 40 minutes after Cashin's unit reached the surface. 220 soldiers. As it turned out, our estimate had been slightly low, arriving in 5 assault carriers with better navigation systems than the dropships, systems that were apparently hardened against the M suppression frequencies the humans had been using. So the first move, the herding, the navigation disruption, that wasn't going to work the second time. What I'm going to tell you next is, again, pieced together from the after-action report and from conversations, and I want to be careful not to make it more cinematic than it was, because the truth is already more extraordinary than anything I could manufacture. The humans changed tactics, not reluctantly, not after a delay, immediately, fluidly, as though this had already been planned for, because it had. Because Major Doherty had spent the 5 hours before the first Vethara wave preparing 2 separate tactical responses, one for if the first engagement bought them significant time, and one for if it didn't. The second response was simpler and less elegant and more direct. It was, hold the physical perimeter of Havenport Station, hold the 3 primary entry points, don't let anything through. 59 personnel, 43 humans and 16 Tharax, against 220 Vethara assault troops. I'm going to stop trying to do the math on that because the math keeps not capturing what actually happened. The math says impossible. The surface said something else. What I can tell you is what the sensor data showed, which was 2 hours and 11 minutes of engagement at the Havenport Station perimeter, 3 significant Vethara breach attempts at the eastern entry corridor, repelled each time, 1 significant breach attempt at the northern service entrance, repelled once with what the sensor data suggested was assistance from Havenport Station's own maintenance personnel, who apparently decided at some point during the second hour that they were going to help. 12,000 people in a sealed habitat watching the perimeter hold, and somewhere between the first and the second hour, the station's own people started helping. The maintenance crew, the engineers, the people who'd been waiting 11 years and had gotten used to waiting, who had, apparently, not quite stopped hoping. I don't know what to do with that, I just know it happened. Chapter 15. The VETHARA Command's Problem. Here's the thing about Admiral Solon that I didn't understand until afterward, when the intelligence analysis caught up with the events. The Vethara military doctrine, as I mentioned, is built around formalized engagements. It's built around a clear assessment of opposing force capability, a deployment plan that matches the assessed threat, and a predictable engagement that proceeds according to established patterns. What Admiral Solon was looking at from his command vessel was not a formalized engagement. It was not a situation that matched any category in his decision matrix. His first wave, 80 soldiers, overwhelming force against no assessed military presence, had been secured, non-lethally, in 14 minutes per unit. His second wave, 220 soldiers now with updated intelligence, against an assessed 59 defenders at fixed positions was being held, not broken through, not routing, not achieving its objectives on any meaningful timeline, held by 59. And the reason his analysts couldn't get clean intelligence on what was happening at those entry points was that the humans had set up sensor disruption in 3 overlapping coverage zones around the perimeter. And while the hardened navigation systems on the assault carriers could cut through the M suppression for navigation purposes, the close-range tactical sensors on individual Vethara soldiers were still being scrambled by the field. The Vethara were fighting partially blind, and they were being held. Salan's third option, the one that his doctrine said you use when ground engagement stalls against unexpected resistance, was orbital fire support. He had the weapon's capability. He could have solved the problem in the simplest possible way at any point in those 2 hours and 11 minutes. He didn't, because approximately 90 minutes into the second wave engagement, a third party arrived in Marin Roman 4 orbital space. Not a human ship, something much larger. The Assembly Emergency Response Fleet, responding to Commander Polly's distress signal. The signal she'd filed within 12 minutes of the Vethara's initial arrival, which had been working its way through Assembly communication chains for almost 2 days, and which had finally reached the desk of someone with enough authority to act on it. 7 Assembly warships, including 2 Celeran capital ships, dropping out of faster-than-light transit into orbital space with their own weapons systems online. The calculus changed entirely in that moment. Salan couldn't use orbital fire support against Havenport Station without drawing a military response from the Assembly fleet. He couldn't continue the ground engagement indefinitely. 2 waves already secured or repelled, his ground assets depleted, his tactical intelligence compromised, his political position suddenly complicated by the presence of a formal Assembly military response that would make any further action a declaration of war rather than an extraction under historical treaty rights. The political ground had shifted. And it had shifted because for 2 hours and 11 minutes, 59 soldiers had held a perimeter on a dying world long enough for the bureaucratic machinery to finally, actually move. 11 years of committee meetings, 11 years of filed reports and diplomatic channels and review processes. 59 soldiers and 2 hours and 11 minutes. Chapter 16, Resolution: The Retreat. Admiral Salan's final transmission was received on the platform at 14:23, Platform Standard Time. It was addressed to Commander Polly's, and it was the longest communication the Vethara had sent us. It cited several treaty provisions, referenced the Assembly fleet's presence in terms that were legally careful, acknowledged certain procedural irregularities in the deployment authorization process, and announced the Vethara's intention to withdraw from Marin Roman 4 orbital space, pending a formal review of extraction rights under current Assembly law. The phrase, pending a formal review, was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. It was the diplomatic equivalent of a door being closed very quietly by someone who would have preferred to slam it. Polly's listened to the full transmission, let the silence sit for a moment after it ended, and then said, "Tiv, open a channel to Major Doherty." When Doherty's voice came through, still slightly elevated from physical exertion, still with that background wind, Polly said, "Major, the Vethara are withdrawing." There was a pause. Then Doherty said, "Copy that." And there was something in those 2 words that I've thought about many times since. Not triumph, not relief exactly, just a kind of settling. The sound of someone who'd held something at considerable personal cost, finally being able to put it down. Then she said, "How's the platform?" And Polly's, who had been in command of a crisis situation for 2 days, and who had just watched something she probably hadn't expected to watch in her career, said, "The platform is fine, Major. How are your people?" "All present," said Doherty. "All mobile. We've got some injuries, nothing critical." A pause. The Therax contingent performed exceptionally. I looked at Cashin, who had come back up to the platform with his soldiers. He was standing at the edge of the room, listening, and his sensory filaments had moved to a position I hadn't seen them in before, not flat, not relaxed, something in between. Something that on a thorax, I was starting to understand, might be what other faces call moved. "I'll pass that along," Polly said. "Commander," Doherty said, "Havenport Station, they need things. Atmospheric processors, medical supplies, food production equipment. They've been waiting 11 years. "I know," Polly said. "They shouldn't have to wait longer." "They won't," Polly said, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there 2 days ago, something firmer, less institutional. "I'm going to make certain of that personally." Chapter 17. After what the meetings felt like. 3 days later, a formal review session was convened on the platform. Assembly oversight, legal analysts, diplomatic representatives, all the machinery of institutional accountability grinding into motion. I sat through 9 hours of it across 2 days, and I want to tell you what those sessions felt like, because I think it matters. Major Doherty appeared in person. She was shorter than I'd imagined. I say this not as a judgment but as an observation, because I'd been constructing a mental image during those 2 hours of watching sensor data, and the mental image was larger. She sat at the testimony table in a standard uniform that was notably cleaner than it would have been 3 days ago, and she answered questions in the same direct, unhurried way she'd talked on the comm channel. She was asked, at several points and by several different committee members, to justify her decision to deploy without assembly authorization. She answered the question the same way each time, with slight variations in phrasing but no variation in substance. 12,000 people, she said. That was the justification. The process was taking 11 years. The process was going to keep taking time that the people on the surface didn't have. I made a decision about what was more important. The committee members had various reactions to this. Some were uncomfortable with it, the precedent it set, the command structure implications, the diplomatic complications. Some were quietly not uncomfortable at all, which showed in the careful neutrality of their follow-up questions. One committee member, a very senior Brunnian administrator whose name I won't include here, said, "Major Doherty, you could have precipitated a war." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Respectfully, Administrator, the situation was already there. I didn't create it. The question wasn't whether something was going to happen. The question was whether someone who could help was going to show up in time." She paused. "I decided to be someone who shows up." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the administrator said something I didn't expect. He said, "For the record, the formal review board notes that the outcome was satisfactory." And then he moved on to the next question as if nothing significant had just occurred. But it had, and everyone in the room knew it.